This is Horror Podcast.
Welcome to This is Horror, a podcast for readers, writers, and creators. I'm Michael David Wilson, and every episode alongside my co-host Bob Pastorella, we chat with the world's best writers about writing, life lessons, creativity, and much more. Today, we are welcoming back the wonderful Cynthia Pelayo to This is Horror Podcast. And what a time to welcome her back, as she has recently released, or will shortly be releasing, 3 books. The hotly anticipated second book in her Chicago series, The Shoemaker's Magician, the re-release of her short story collection, Loteria, and the wonderful novel-length prose poem, Crime Scene. She is one of the best writers in the crime and horror genres, and we always have a fun time hanging out with her. Now, apropos for a horror podcast, Cina actually recorded this whilst in a cabin in the woods. Although this does mean that at times the audio quality isn't quite as sharp, but I think you'll agree in terms of Cina's wit and commentary on literature, it is as sharp as a Japanese santoku knife. So before we jump into the conversation, it is time for a quick advert break.
Coming soon from Mother Horde and Cemetery Gates Media, the debut novella from P.L. Watts, The Bonnie Swans. When Anne O'Donnell arrives in a dock in 1789 France with no member repast, she allows herself to be renamed Marguerite and taken as the governor's Vermilion, the petulant daughter of a rich merchant. But the chateau holds many secrets, some deadly. Wendy and Wagner says the Bonnie Swans brings together all the best of Gothic tropes: a troubled family, a struggling governess, an unhappy child, and stews them in magic, the French Revolution, and queer vibes. For more information, visit cemeterygatesmedia.com.
Cosmovorous, the debut cosmic horror novel from R.C. Housen. Esmeralda has lived on the fringes of society for as long as she can remember, until a Halloween night gone wrong unlocks a cache of nightmarish memories. Visions of a bizarre desert town, images of a mysterious woman, the pain of an ultimate betrayal, and the shame of a bargain made in blood. Now she must travel back and learn the true nature of the ravenous cosmos. Cosmovorous, available everywhere books are sold.
Okay, well, with that said, here it is. It is Cynthia Pelayo on This is Horror. Cina, welcome back to This is Horror. It is so good to have you here.
Hello, it's great to be back. When was I here last? It was like 2021, so it's been a couple years.
Yeah, so the last episode we did with you, it aired in September 2021. So by my maths, I reckon that'll mean we spoke in the summer. So it's been about a year and a half.
Wow. Oh my god. Wow. Time flies. Time flies. I'm in a tiny cabin in the woods in the middle of nowhere. And my son is in the background crunching on cheesy poofs. So if you hear that, that's my son, because I am hiding in a cabin while I finish edits for my novel that's coming out in 2024.
Yeah, well, it's certainly apropos for a horror writer to be in a cabin in the woods. So we appreciate the dedication, really, to come in on the podcast. And it's like, right, well, I'll be in a cabin in the woods.
And it's it's tiny, one of these tiny little, modern ones. And so the furthest I can get away from my son is like the top bunk. So it's like a coffin that I'm in. It's just like I only have space for just to lay down. So I'm kind of laying down and just staring up at this pine ceiling here. So if it sounds like I'm laying down, everyone, I'm laying down on this platform bed.
Yeah. So I mean, is this a cabin that you've gone to before for writing, or is this your first time there?
I've been here once before and I liked it so much, and it's like close to the city, so it's manageable. Like I don't want to drive too far away from the city, but and you'll hear my son laughing throughout the episode, so you're welcome. Yeah, so it's close to the city, which is nice. I just I as people know, I write fairy tales, and so
Mm,
it just it just kind of helps to be here in this type of environment to get in that headspace.
mm, yeah, yeah. Well, I'm wondering, in the last 18 months, what have been the biggest changes for you both personally and professionally?
Oh gosh. Um, Personally, oh my gosh, I'll come back to personally. I don't know. Professionally, it's been crazy, which is a good crazy. Children of Chicago came out and it generated a lot of buzz, and I think it's because of the storyline and you'll hear me around the little cabin. Um, but it generated a lot more controversy than I thought it was going to. And so um, that took off and became a life of its own, which was a little scary. I think people don't prepare you to go viral or to become like a topic of conversation. It's actually really scary. So like, I had to take some social media breaks or whatnot, but so that happened. Children of Chicago. I since the last time I was nominated, Children of Chicago was nominated for Best Novel last year for the Bram Stoker Awards. I'm going to be a guest of honor this year at StokerCon. I have two. Oh gosh, I've had a few releases. So Crime Scene came out. Loteria, which is my short story collection from like 2010. It was like my thesis originally for my Master's of Fine Arts in Writing at the School of the Art Institute, is being re-released next month from Polis Books. The Shoemaker's Magician, which is the second book in the Chicago saga, is released in March. And then I signed with Thomas and Mercer, Amazon Publishing, and so my first release with them comes out 2024, and then the next one in 2025. So it's been nonstop from a writing perspective, and I'm trying to. Every time I think I've caught my breath, it's like, haha, something else amazing jumps in,
Mm,
and I have to accommodate for that in my life. In terms of my personal life, I think things are still um, just trying to keep everything together. I have two children that are both on the autism spectrum, and my husband, and we live in the city in Chicago. My dad, who is like instrumental in helping me to want to become a writer. Um, Originally, I was a journalist because of him. His cancer is now terminal, so it's been a little. Um, he's been sick for a long time, and it's something that we all sort of knew was coming. But it's just, just trying to trying to process life and cycles and what does that mean. And I think even in just like that year and a half since I've spoken to you all, I think I've matured a lot more as a writer and just as a person.
yeah, there's so much to kind of talk about and to jump into from there. But I mean, in terms of your father's terminal cancer, I mean, having that diagnosis, what kind of things have you done as a family? I mean, what can one do? It's a situation that, of course, most of us are completely unprepared for.
So I think I I really want to be able to take him back to Puerto Rico for one more visit. I was born there. My dad was born there. I just don't. We're waiting to see if that's even a possibility, and I think it would be heartbreaking if I can't do that for him. And even if I do that for him, I can't even imagine his headspace and visiting and knowing this is the last time I'm coming home. So there's just been, a lot of processing. What do we want? his last few, his last time to look like. And for me, I want to spend time with him doing the things that helped me become a writer. Like, I think, Sunday mornings, my dad and I would, make coffee and get the newspaper and read the newspaper and talk about the articles we read. And it was always very important for him that I was aware of the world around me, which is why I went into journalism originally. But now he knows I'm a fiction writer, and he wasn't supportive at first. He thought it was silly, and because journalism is much more of a serious profession in his eyes. But when I was featured in like the Chicago Tribune, and it was more so like our local Chicago papers, where he started seeing like pictures of me and like coverage of my books, that he finally, it clicked for him, and he finally looked at me recently like, I'm proud of you that you're doing this. And so I'm happy that he did that. So I finally got his validation, which I know we shouldn't work and write for validation, but my father is probably one of my favorite people on this planet. So losing him is going to be pretty difficult. And so I'm just trying to prepare. What does that look like for me and my children, who love Grandpa because he's just ridiculous. He's like a personality. He walks into a room and he's in the room.
And I think what you're doing with your writing, I mean, particularly crime scene, it is journalism in a sense. I know that it's fiction, but you're also it's almost more real than journalism, because these days there is so much grief, there is so much sadness and trauma that we consume on a daily basis, that there's this bizarre situation where we can be reading about murders and tragedy and grief, but we're doing it while eating our breakfast and just kind of getting on with things. But in crime scene, and indeed with the vast majority of your fiction, you're not allowing us to do that. There are these things that we'd rather not look at, and you are forcing us to really look at it and to experience it. So in a way, as bizarre as it might seem, writing a prose poem in the former crime scene is more real than writing an article on a crime in a journalistic piece.
I think in many ways it is, because a journalistic piece is just going to give you, like, here are the facts. Like, this happened at this day to this person at this time, and this is all we know. And it's very sanitized. And so there is no emotional component when you read that. But then when you write a prose poem, you can definitely take the liberty to inject emotion into this and provide the reader with some of the elements of terror that individual was encountering at those final moments. And so I know some people may think that that's grim and gruesome, but I think and I was one of those, I was definitely true crime obsessed for quite a long time. And I think my obsession with true crime was more just like the fascination that there are people out there that do these things to other people. And I think that we are just not meant to understand that type of brain. And I was driving myself just like sick with trying to understand, how can someone pick somebody up off of the street and inflict this trauma onto them for a prolonged period of time and dispose of them and just go about their regular day. That's just completely, I can't even process that. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that in crime scene, and how these crimes just continue to happen over and over, and we are dismissive about it as a society, and we just kind of move on to the next news story that's not necessarily of importance, but yet all these unsolved cases, missing persons, unsolved homicides, And that was my commentary with Crime Scene. It's like, it doesn't end. It's continuing. It happens anywhere and everywhere, especially in the United States, which is terrifying to any kind of person. Children, to women, to grown-up men, to, transgender people are facing this epidemic of hurt and harm. And we're not talking about it. Well, it just seems like, one thing happens and we move on to the next.
Yeah, I think so. And I feel as well, and I don't know if we touched on this last time, but as human beings, we weren't built to consume all this tragedy, because we used to just be in these little communities, but now we've got access to just what's going on globally. And so I wonder if, in a way, our kind of built-in defense mechanism to that is to anesthetize us to it so that we don't feel anything from any of these stories, because if we were to feel something with all of them, it would just be so consuming that we probably couldn't do anything. We'd become catatonic with depression.
Right. I don't think we're the amount of information that we consume, and not just, our regular leisurely information, like our, books or film, art, whatnot, but like social media. I don't think we were meant to, be exposed to like the stream of consciousness of millions of people at any given point of time. It is just so much information to sift through, and our attention spans are probably suffering because of it. And we're not taking pause to really think about the world that we live in and think about the decisions that we make, the decisions that our peers make, or other people in our community. As someone that grew up without the internet, it's very fascinating to be able to process what it is now versus what it used to look like. There wasn't all of this information. Granted, crime has always been a constant, and phones have definitely contributed to capturing people or preventing crimes from happening. I mean, they've helped us see a lot of definite injustice that has happened to marginalized groups because of being able to take pictures and record video. And so there have been benefits to social media, but there's been a lot of hurt and harm as well.
Yeah, I think so. And you spoke about we're not supposed to be exposed to the stream of consciousness from others. And I think as well, when using social media, it's important to remind ourselves that we don't have to deliver our own stream of consciousness, because if we're not careful, we can become so wired that anything that happens, we want to write a tweet about it. We just don't need to do that.
I'm guilty of it. I mean, I think that's definitely part of how I was a horror writer back in 2010, and I wrote and published some works, and then I took about 4 years off, like from 3 years off in 2016 and 2019. And when I came back into the horror space, I went full on into social media and meeting people and tweeting every random thought that I had and getting involved in like the day's discourse until like it started deteriorating my mental health.
Yeah.
Because I would go on there and I would wake up in the morning, which is the worst thing absolute worst thing you can ever do is wake up in the morning and reach for your phone. Don't ever do that, everyone. Don't ever do that. The very first thing you should do when you wake up in the morning is just be grateful that you have like another morning and just sit with your peace for a moment. But I would just spend hours online and getting involved in whatever discussion was happening. And yesterday I looked and Of course, there were a slew of like discussions that were happening in like the writer space, and I thought, I thought to myself like, this will take so much. What do I want to do? Do I want to allow all of this to take up my psychic energy, or do I just want to write? And so I'm like, I just want to write. That's all I want to do. I don't want to be a social media figure. And I don't think that, and it's hard because I know that part of the reason I'm being recognized as a guest of honor for StokerCon is because of my work in the horror community and supporting people and championing people. But I feel like I can do that with my mentoring, and with other work that I do with HWA. I'm it's just social media. I've taken a step back from what I feel like I used to be, and I put that time into the writing because ultimately that's what we want to do. We're here to write. Yeah, that's what I want to do. I just want to spend my time writing as much as I can.
Yeah. But I mean, in terms of going back to crime scene, I wonder what were some of the biggest challenges of writing a 128-page prose poem?
So it's funny. I started writing it, and then I had to stop because I started writing it in pieces. So it was like I would write one poem and then another poem, and then that was not working. And I had to step back and think of it as it's a story, it's one single cohesive narrative. And so I had to step back and then plot it out the way I would any novel. Of course, it wasn't going to be as long, but I had to think about it as a novel. And so when I went through and I wrote the outline, I wrote it as a 3-act story. And so that was the initial challenge. It was just the shape of it and how it was going to look on the page, because people probably don't engage with poetry much, or when they engage with poetry, they probably aren't used to a poem that is, one story. So that was the challenge. And then the other challenge was, how do I make this? How do I, almost like with Into the Forest and All the Way Through was a true crime poetry collection. And with Crime Scene, I wanted to be able to generate in the reader the same intensity of emotions, like the range of emotions that one felt and Into the Forest, that they felt when Into the Forest, and I wanted to inject that in Crime Scene. And so I think of it as like a temperature, like each individual poem would have different temperatures throughout. So then that was another way of layering the thought and the outline, because there are pieces that are more reflective, but then there are pieces that really like zoom in on the graphic nature of, let's say, like an autopsy. Like, do we even think, you might think of in an autopsy from like a detective show and how fascinating it is, but is it really fascinating? It's like it's sad in a way, as someone is being like, pulled apart and liquids are being collected in order to determine what was done to them. So I wanted to be able to talk about that, and also use different styles throughout. I didn't want it to, I think the danger with writing a story in verse is that everything would just sound the same, and I didn't want that at all. I wanted each individual poem to have a different tone, have a different rhythm, a different pace.
Yeah, and I think you did that masterfully, and I mean, it, and as I think is the job of good poetry, I mean, you could pack so much into so few words. I mean, just some of these lines, like, there will never be another summertime lullaby, and blackened bones glisten in his vomit. Like, you're capturing so much in so little. And I mean, I found it both beautiful and disturbing, both poignant and heartbreaking. And I mean, that is presumably exactly what you were going for.
Yeah, yeah, I wanted people to feel like what, feel that range of emotions of someone not only being lost,
Mm,
but somebody whose job it is to do this over and over again, to search for what happened to somebody. Like that is definitely not a job I'm equipped for, a career that I'm equipped for emotionally. I could not imagine the emotional, the psychological, mental strain an individual goes through when they arrive at a crime scene and they have to take command of of the situation, and they have to right away start assessing and what happened, creating a profile if they determine it to be a homicide. Like I just can't even imagine the amount of brain power that goes into that.
mm, yeah, yeah. And I think telling the story through poems, I mean, to me, it seems to mimic a crime investigation and following clues better than a conventional prose piece would.
Oh well, thank you. Um, yeah, I think I wanted to take several aspects of the investigation process and focus in on them a little bit more than we see in a novel or whatnot. You know, you would just read like, you know, a quick paragraph or a sentence of, and we went to the medical examiner's office, and it's like, no, I wanted to really create like this cold and sterile environment and show you what does it look like in a medical examiner's office? What does it look like? What does it feel like in an interrogation room? What are the emotions that someone's probably feeling when someone's sitting across from them and is, you know, uh, not being cooperative? So I wanted to be able to express that. I wanted to be able to express like, what does a crime scene look like? I don't think many people realize that, especially you know, crime scene takes place in the cabin in the woods, but it takes place like in a wooded area. And one thing that I read from investigators is that one of the difficult aspects of recovering a body and like in a wooded area is that over time the body decomposes in such a way that it does become difficult to even to even spot that body in this type of landscape. It just starts taking on the shape of and form of the landscape around it, like, you know, being covered in leaves and um, completely decayed to the point where you can't really, there's no indication that it was once a person, and the bones could sometimes be carried off by small critters. And so it's like, that is just so sad to me. So sad to me to think that how many people are were disposed of in these beautiful landscapes, and like the very last thing that they saw was like the sky above or like a tree beside them, and that's where they're still at, waiting to be found.
Mm, yeah. Well, how did Agent K first come into your life?
I was thinking of Detective Lauren Medina a lot from Children of Chicago,
Mm,
and I was like, but it's not the same detective, because Detective Lauren Medina is, yeah, a little bit more difficult. I wanted somebody that was more of a martyr, but very somber. And I wanted somebody without a name, so that's why I just gave her, you know, I initially used just Detective K throughout, and I do give her like a name at the end. But the detectives were like Detective K and Detective M. I was like, K for kill and M for murder. That's the way I thought about it. Is at first is like, this is what they do. Like they investigate killings and they investigate murders. So I wanted to keep things as generic terms of who they were as possible so that they could be agents in any location. So
Mm.
I wanted that feeling where it wasn't a particular city or particular town. This could be any agent, a special agent that investigates homicides.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. And I wondered too, obviously, this starts with two kids finding a dead body. Have you ever
Hmm.
discovered a dead body?
No, but I've seen dead bodies. When I was a journalist,
Mm.
so I've seen bodies in the street from gunfire. So
Mm.
it's young people, not necessarily, 17, 18-year-olds and children. I mean, they're children. So there's one in particular that I remember that I can't get him out of my head. I still think about him. And it's something that sticks with you. It doesn't go away. You just think of the sadness of just seeing someone stood there on the street and how just a quick action just ended a person's life. So, and I wanted to write about what to how would I mean if I saw that and I was in my 20s and it's stayed with me for until now, what would happen to two small children? I think, and I wanted to write about that innocence, like, and how that innocence was taken away from them because they came across this crime scene. And so, how did that moment impact their entire life? And that's one of the things I've said about just crime in general is that a, a homicide ripples across a family and community. If someone is lost, it could be somebody's, um, let's just say someone's mother is murdered. Well, what happens to those children? What kinds of feelings and emotions are going to happen to those children? It's going to carry on for generations, and their partner. That's going to carry on for generations as well. And there's always going to be these questions and this lingering trauma. Like it doesn't when a single person is lost, it is just not that that single person was lost. It was like so many lives are destroyed and changed and set off course of what they were originally at. Just because some wicked and evil person, thought that they could do these awful things. And of course, these evil people don't care. They're out there. They do awful things. Um, and so I wanted to write about that and then show, well, what happened to these children the older they got and how that crime impacted their life.
Mm. Yeah. And I recall the first time that we spoke, you talking about how, your own innocence was, in a sense, taken away at an early age. You became aware of the injustices in the world fairly early on.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I grew up in inner city Chicago, which in the 80s and 90s, I mean, there's still areas where it's still very difficult. But there was a lot of gangs, guns, a lot of death, a lot of fights, a lot of just a lot of anger. I know people who were killed too young. I know people who killed people when they were very young,
Mm.
and I saw communities destroyed. I saw what it did to parents and to siblings and to partners. Like how it just utterly destroyed people. I saw someone, gosh, who lost his. A good example was someone who lost his brother and to violence, and for years we thought he was doing well, and no, it just came back one day, and it emerged in the form of alcoholism for him, and because he felt guilty, like he just took on this guilty feeling that his brother was murdered, and he could not come to terms with it, and he eventually died from alcoholism, and it was just it was just so tragic because he would cite that. And he would cite, I'm drinking because I'm dreaming about him and I'm seeing him and I wasn't there for him. And it's just awful to see this. And I still carry this. I still carry a lot of this because it doesn't go away. It doesn't go away. It's become a part of who I am and a part of what I write. But I feel like I didn't allow it to harden me, and I also didn't allow it to darken me either. Like I didn't, I could have easily have, gotten lost in like these, intense and sad feelings from seeing so much hurt and harm. And I felt like what I could do to combat that and to rebel against all that violence and hurt and harm that I saw was to become a positive person in the community and to show the youth in our neighborhood that, you can live your life and work towards what you want to become, and you don't have to allow these evil things to define you. I was not going to allow any of those evil things that were like in my periphery to take me down. That was not going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah, and talking about things taking you down, this may be a bit of a tenuous segue, but of course earlier in the conversation you spoke about the controversy when Children of Chicago went viral, and obviously that having an effect on you. So I'm wondering, what were some of the main controversies, or what were some of the main things that you experienced as a result of that, and then how did you navigate it and protect your own health?
Yeah, so the definitely a lot of the controversy was around. I mean, I write across genres, so I think that I need to establish that, and so I write crime, I write mystery, I write horror, I write a range of genres, detective, police procedurals, and so I feel like even though on the back the description of the book says Detective Lauren Medina, so I think when a lot of people came to the novel, they knew me from Into the Forest, or they knew me from my other horror stories, and they stepped into it and they're like, well, this is a cop book. I was like, well, the description says it in the back. It's a detective story. And so, it's the world that we live in. We've been trying to hold law enforcement accountable for the multitude of injustices that we have seen over time, over history. And so I think there was some belief that book was meant, the book was written in a way to praise any witch person. And, Children of Chicago is a commentary on youth violence in the city of Chicago. And it's also a commentary on the people we believe that are in charge of taking care of us and protecting us sometimes are not the ones that are taking care of us or have our best interests, and sometimes are the ones that are doing the most harm. So that was my commentary, and I think maybe for some people this was definitely at a time where the George Floyd murder happened, and there was a lot going on in the media, and so when the book came out, it came out at that time. And I remember people saying, well, now a cop book is being released right now. And it's just like, well, I wrote this like years ago. And I'm also a member of the Mystery Writers of America. I'm also a mystery writer. So, this is a genre that I write. I blend genres. And so I felt like I kind of had to get defensive for a little bit. And it wasn't that I don't think I was defending the critique, because I believe that, I 100% believe if you read something and it does, you don't like it, totally, everyone has a right to their opinion, and, reviews are for reviewers. But I was kind of shocked that people were like, why did you write this book? And I think they probably thought it was going to be something else. Like, I don't know. Maybe they thought I was going to write about monsters. I have no clue. I just don't, I don't understand what it was people went into it expecting. I thought that the description on the back of the book was very clear that this was a detective novel with horror. So that was part of it. And so um, I think that it was hurtful and harmful that people thought I was trying to create some type of harm with the book. And so that was upsetting. I was like, I've had people like in my family murdered by law enforcement. It's like it, it was difficult. It was very, very difficult, very, very difficult for me to hear some of the criticism um, that people thought I was trying to create harm. And I was like, yeah, that was not my intention with the book at all. My intention with the book was to, if you read the book, um, you see what type of character um, the main protagonist is. So I took some time off of social media because I was like, I just should not be here. And I had to process a lot of things. And then I think I've started using social media a little bit differently since then. I don't read reviews at all. It's none of my business what's in a review. I don't care. It's when, when people were like, publicly stating Cynthia's intentions were X, Y, and Z. I was like, well, no, you can't say that. That was not my intention at all. That's when I take issue with stuff. But even that, now I'm just kind of like, you know what? I'm staying away from any type of critique of what I write, what's on any review sites. I mean, the book that my release for my upcoming releases aren't detective novels, blends. I mean, that was part of my focus and my master of fine arts in writing at the School of the Art Institute was on detective fiction. I studied Poe, who invented the role of the detective with C. Auguste Dupin, and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes and Agatha Christie's various detectives. I'm fascinated by these individuals whose job it is to investigate and to analyze. And so that's just, one of my interests. And I think that's definitely something that I'm going to continue exploring in my fiction. I forgot the third part of your question, but that's part of, I think to finish what I've learned, I think what I've learned is from all of that, from going viral, is that, just step out of it, just step away from it. I mean, things take on a life of their own, and so it's just better just to kind of step away. We're creators. Everyone, I think every writer has a right to write whatever they want. Of course, if you write like stereotypical, hurtful, or harmful depictions, you're going to get criticized. There's going to be critique. There's going to be critique regardless. Just step away from it. I mean, we have to write. I hope that most authors, especially in horror, are trying to be as respectful of various groups as possible. I hope that people in horror are not trying to create some direct harm to individuals. And at least for my horror, the horror I write, I wanted to highlight, or I do want to highlight, the true horrors that are out there in the world. And if anything, if Children of Chicago made you sit back and be like, I'm really mad that these bad people exist, well, then I guess I accomplished what I set out to do, because that was part of my intention with the book, was to make you so mad at the end with this main character that you were like, I was duped all along to sympathize for this person. Yeah, you probably were. And that was probably part of my intention, to show you how we can easily believe that somebody has our best interests and they don't.
Yeah. Did you ever get any kind of mail from people who were annoyed as to how it had ended, because I imagine that would have been quite a point of contention and very polarizing.
Someone said they threw it across the room. They were like, I threw the book across the room, and a few people were like, the book doesn't even really end. And I was like, I know, isn't that awful? And that was like my response. I was like, well, yeah, it's awful that it doesn't really end because crime doesn't really end. And I think people are going to be even more like upset because the follow-up, the Shoemaker's Magician, has nothing to do with Children of Chicago. It is a standalone. It is still it's a story in the universe. You do find out there is one chapter devoted to, I mean, Lauren Medina is kind of like the ghost that kind of hovers throughout the book, as she's mentioned in bits and pieces, but you do sort of find out what happened to her. But the Shoemaker's Magician is a very different type of story. It's still a detective story, but it's more it's probably more speculative because there's a lot of fantastical elements in it. And it follows Paloma Ramos, who is a YouTuber who hosts a horror YouTube channel where she reviews and talks about horror movies from the earliest horror films, the black and white films, to present day. And her husband, Sebastian Ramos, is a homicide detective, and he finds a body at the Chicago Theater. And it also deals with the iconic figure of the horror host. You know, we know Elvira and Vampira, so it does feature those elements. I don't talk about it too much because I don't want to give it away, but it does deal with abandoned movie palaces in Chicago, the history of the horror host, magic, high magic, which is Golden Dawn, esoteric, occult rituals. So I hope people like it. It's very different than Children of Chicago. It's not as mean, I want to say. I think Children of Chicago was very mean. It was a mean book. The detective in that book was very mean and cold and disconnected. But the protagonist and the Shoemaker's Magician, Paloma, is a YouTuber who is a little agoraphobic and doesn't like to leave her house. And she's madly in love with her little boy who is on the autism spectrum, and she wants to do everything that she can to protect him.
See, and with Children of Chicago, as you said, there were some people in the horror community who were upset that it was too crime. Now you're going to have people in the crime fiction community who are upset that this one has too many speculative elements. And it's like, look, Cina's just fucking with you. You don't know what she's going to do.
Exactly. And we should, I think that was definitely with Children of Chicago. People were like, but this is a crime book. I'm like, ha, ta-da. Yeah, I write it. I write across genres, and if there's anything I want to do in my career, is I want to be able to obliterate this idea of genre. I want to be able to play in any genre box that I want. I want to be able to, I do love speculative, and I feel like that's kind of where my home is always going to be. But I was telling Brian Keene the other day, I was like, I really want to write just like a sweeping historical novel one day, like without speculative elements. And so I think that's what's exciting about being a writer, is that we have this amazing, not just talent, this is magic what we do. We create worlds and create people and stories. And so I don't want to be restricted to any one design of a story. I don't want to write vampire stories for the rest of my life. I want to write, crime scene. That's not, there's really no speculative elements in that. There's probably like some dream, or like when she wakes up from some nightmares, that you might kind of feel like there's like this watery element of speculative, but it wasn't a speculative poetry comics. I don't think.
No.
Is more grounded in realism, and so I hope people realize that when they come to my writing, you never know what you're going to get, and it's always going. My goal is to always be different, each and every time. I do say that I write fairy tales. I think Children of Chicago is definitely a fairy tale. It's adapted. It's an adaptation of the Pied Piper fairy tale.
Mm.
The Shoemaker's Magician is not a fairy tale. It's a fable. The book explains why it's a fable, but it's basically there's a moral to the story. If you read the story, there's gonna be a moral there. My release for Thomas and Mercer in 2024 is an adaptation of The Little Mermaid, which that's been announced. So if you look at the publisher's marketplace, you would see it says the adaptation of The Little Mermaid. But I love fairy tales. That was also so yeah. That's when I was studying my MFA. My focus was on detective fiction, fairy tales, folklore, and then plays. I worked with a playwright. Who was one of my graduate advisors. So I was really fascinated and the structure and the form of plays influenced my writing as well.
Yeah, I could just imagine at the time maybe some resistant professors being like, oh, well, what on earth is she going to do with detective fiction, fairy tales, and plays? And it's like, surprise, motherfucker. This is what we're doing.
I don't want to be boring, and you have to write what you like, and like these are the things that make me excited and I enjoy. I don't have much time anymore, but I used to love going to the theater and watching various plays or experimental performances, and I just think there's so much that can be done there structurally. And yeah, I like you said, I'm just here to fuck with people. I just I hope that that's what I continue doing in my writing career. I want to continue to experiment. I want to continue to push myself, push what it is I can write and layer. And I know right now, like my next, again, my 2024 release is another detective fairy tale type novel, a historical detective fairy tales and historical. The one in 2025 is sci-fi. So it has sci-fi elements and horror and not necessarily historical, but maybe a little bit more just like drama. So it's going to be interesting that to see how that one's going to play out and be received, because that one deals with a lot of big ideas. So we'll see how people receive that. But I'm never going to write the same thing. I don't want to write the same thing. And I know that there are people that they enjoy writing the same type of story, and that's wonderful. You have to write what makes you happy. For me, I want to do something different each and every time I sit down and work on a new project.
Yeah. And I mean, as a writer and as a reader, I think, having the author write in a range of genres and being unsure exactly what they're going to do next keeps things very interesting. But I do wonder, has there been any pushback or reluctance from editors and publishers? Because, I mean, they can want things to sit in neat genre boxes, or at least to have you keep doing the same thing. I mean, we were talking to Dean Koontz the other day. Now you're publishing mate with Thomas and Mercer, and I don't know if you know, but when he originally wrote Odd Thomas, his publisher was not happy because it completely deviated from what he had done before, and well, seemed to work out okay for him in the end, didn't it?
Well, we actually share the same editor,
Right.
today,
Nice,
which
nice.
is bananas, completely insane to me. But I mean, he's been writing forever, and so like his work is just, he's an icon.
Yeah.
But I think right now I'm just I am learning how to adapt my style from the indie presses into like a larger publisher. because there's different, I think what makes the indies, especially indie horror, just so fantastic is that the level of the range and the freedom for experimentation that is available there. So, and then with a larger publisher and various imprints, you have, one thing I was learning was just that, each imprint has its own theme and approach. And so that's what I'm learning. Like, how do you write within the parameters of this imprint or this publisher? Because there's different sorts of needs given because of the wider readership. So I think with with like Amazon Publishing, for example, it's like they're going to have or Thomas and Mercer specifically, they have a wider readership in terms of like in comparison to like maybe within the indie horror space. So I guess the best example is what I told Brian Keane the other day. It's like, well, whereas in the indie space, I probably would have like killed everybody in my story. I probably can't get away with that, like at a larger publisher,
Right.
because you don't want to upset people. As opposed to like an indie, they'll be like, "Yeah, you killed everybody, amazing." You can't get away with that, probably at a larger publisher, because you might make the reader sad. We want we want to make sure that we're considering the readership that we're writing for.
Thank you so much for listening to This Is Horror with Cynthia Pelayo. Do join us again next time for the second and final part of the conversation, where we discuss Cynthia's Thomas and Mercer Amazon book deal, her literary agent Lane Haymont, the re-release of Loteria, and much more. But if you want it ahead of the crowd, if you want every episode ahead of the crowd, if you want to support This Is Horror podcast, then become our patron at patreon.com/This Is Horror. Now, before I wrap up, it is time for a quick advert break.
Cosmovorous, the debut cosmic horror novel from R.C. Housen. Esmeralda has lived on the fringes of society for as long as she can remember, until a Halloween night gone wrong unlocks a cache of nightmarish memories. Visions of a bizarre desert town, images of a mysterious woman, the pain of an ultimate betrayal, and the shame of a bargain made in blood. Now she must travel back and learn the true nature of the ravenous cosmos. Cosmovorous, available everywhere books are sold.
Coming soon from Mother Horror and Cemetery Gates Media, the debut novella from P.L. Watts, The Bonnie Swans. When Anne O'Donnell arrives in a dock in 1789 France with no member repast, she allows herself to be renamed Marguerite and taken in as the governess Vermilion, the petulant daughter of a rich merchant. But the chateau holds many secrets, some deadly. Wendy and Wagner says the Bonnie Swans brings together all the best of Gothic tropes: a troubled family, a struggling governess, an unhappy child, and stews them in magic, the French Revolution, and queer vibes. For more information, visit cemeterygatesmedia.com.
As always, I would like to end with a quote, and this is from Helen Keller. Although the world is full of suffering, it is also full of the overcoming of it. I'll see you in the next episode for the second part of the conversation with Cynthia Pelayo. But until then, take care of yourselves, be good to one another, read horror, keep on writing, and have a great, great day.
This is Horror Podcast.